On a
Life in
cold,
prison.
bleak evening in
No,
March 2024,
please.
downtown
No.
Cleveland, Ohio, was shaken by a violent incident that would soon grip the city's attention. Police officers responding to a 911 call arrived at a small convenience store on East 9th Street to find local store owner Harold Jennings lying motionless near the cash register, his body riddled with multiple stab wounds. Standing just feet away was 17-year-old Marcus Reynolds, his hands trembling slightly, his face pale but composed. Marcus claimed he acted in self-defense, insisting that he had only intended to scare Jennings after being threatened. But the brutal nature of the crime and the scene suggested a far more complicated story. Detective Laura Chen was the first lead investigator on the scene. As she stepped into the cramped, dimly lit store, the scent of blood mingled with the stale odor of spilled coffee and broken glass. Shelves were overturned, and products lay scattered across the floor, evidence of a violent struggle. The victim's body, slumped near the cash register, bore the marks of a frenzied attack. Despite the chaos, Marcus stood nearby, his posture guarded yet unnervingly calm. Chen noted the contrast immediately. His calmness seemed at odds with the savage crime they were investigating. Before we dive into this shocking case, make sure to subscribe and like the video so you never miss a story. And tell me, what are your thoughts on how the justice system handles young offenders? Marcus told officers that earlier that evening, he had entered the store to buy snacks, but was confronted by Jennings, who allegedly threatened him. Feeling cornered and fearing for his safety, Marcus said he grabbed a knife from the counter in self-defense. He claimed the stabbing was unintentional, a desperate act to fend off the threat. But his story raised more questions than it answered. Why was he still at the scene, standing so close to the victim? Why did the scene look more like a violent assault than a desperate act of defense? Detective Chen began her initial assessment, carefully noting the details of the scene. The knife used in the stabbing was found discarded nearby, its blade wiped clean but still ominously close to the victim. The store's interior bore the marks of a struggle. An overturned display of chips, broken glass from a shattered soda bottle, and smears of blood on the linoleum floor. Witnesses would soon describe hearing raised voices and the sound of a scuffle moments before the fatal stabbing. But their accounts varied widely, complicating the investigation's early stages. The local community, usually accustomed to the quiet hum of daily life, was rocked by the news. Harold Jennings was a known figure in the neighborhood, a small business owner who had operated the convenience store for over 2 decades. His reputation was that of a friendly, if somewhat stern man, who knew most of his customers by name. The violence that claimed his life sent ripples of shock and sorrow through the streets. Rumors began to spread quickly, many pointing fingers at Marcus, the young man found at the scene, as the likely perpetrator. Detective Chen's initial interviews with bystanders and neighbors painted a murky picture. Some described Marcus as agitated and angry, while others recalled seeing him exchange tense words with Jennings earlier that day. A few witnesses mentioned overhearing threats from both sides, but no one had seen the actual stabbing. The conflicting stories made it difficult to piece together a clear timeline. Chen's keen investigative instincts told her that the truth lay somewhere beneath the surface of these fragmented accounts. Marcus's demeanor during questioning was a study in contradiction. He appeared composed, answering questions in a measured tone. Yet there was an undercurrent of defensiveness. When asked why he didn't call for help or leave the scene immediately, Marcus said he was in shock, unsure of what to do. Yet, Detective Chen noted a lack of overt panic or confusion in his responses. His calmness, while perhaps a coping mechanism, struck her as unusual given the severity of the crime. As the night wore on, Forensic teams arrived to begin collecting evidence. The store was cordoned off, and meticulous photographs documented every detail, from the blood spatter patterns on the walls to the position of the victim's body and the location of the discarded knife. These early measurements and observations would prove crucial in unraveling the events leading to Jennings' death. Detective Chen herself oversaw the initial sweep, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Outside the store, a small crowd gathered, their faces a mixture of grief, anger, and curiosity. Among them was Harold Jennings' niece, Lisa, who had rushed to the scene upon hearing the news. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke to reporters, describing her uncle as a hard-working man who had never been involved in trouble. She expressed disbelief that someone so young could be implicated in such a violent crime. The community's mood was somber, with many fearing that this incident marked a troubling shift in the neighborhood's safety. Detective Chen's thoughts returned repeatedly to Marcus. The teenager's claim of self-defense was plausible on the surface, but the evidence at the scene suggested a more complex narrative. Chen knew that initial impressions could be deceiving, especially in cases involving young suspects who might be scared or confused. Her priority was to gather as much information as possible before drawing conclusions. As dawn approached, the investigation team began to piece together the sequence of events from witness statements and forensic evidence. Marcus's version of the night would soon face intense scrutiny, and Detective Chen anticipated that the days ahead would bring difficult revelations. The stabbing of Harold Jennings was not just a tragic loss for the community, but the beginning of a case that would challenge assumptions about youth, violence, and justice in Cleveland. In the quiet moments before the city fully awoke, Detective Chen reviewed her notes, preparing for the interviews and evidence analysis that would come next. Marcus Reynolds' fate and the truth behind the stabbing hung in the balance, waiting to be uncovered through meticulous investigation and the pursuit of justice. The crime scene inside Harold Jennings' convenience store revealed a disturbing tableau of violence and chaos, painting a grim picture of the fatal encounter. Detective Laura Chen observed the scattered debris, overturned shelves, broken glass glittering under the harsh fluorescent lights, and products strewn haphazardly across the floor. The once orderly store was transformed into a battleground, a silent witness to the struggle that ended in Jennings' death. The victim lay near the cash register, his body bearing multiple stab wounds. Forensic experts noted that the wounds were concentrated in the torso, inflicted with a degree of force and precision that suggested more than a panicked defense. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife found discarded near the body, had been wiped clean of fingerprints, an unusual detail that raised immediate suspicion. The absence of Marcus Reynolds' fingerprints on the blade contrasted sharply with the blood spatter found on his clothing, a forensic inconsistency that would soon become a focal point of the investigation. The local community was thrown into turmoil by the incident. Harold Jennings was not just a store owner. He was a fixture in the neighborhood, a man who had served residents for over 20 years. News of his violent death spread rapidly, fueling rumors and speculation about the circumstances and Marcus's role. Some community members expressed shock and disbelief that the teenager, known to many as a troubled but nonviolent youth, could be connected to such a brutal crime. Others whispered about a deeper, more complex conflict between the two men. Detective Chen's team canvassed the surrounding area, seeking witnesses who might shed light on the events leading up to the stabbing. The accounts they collected painted an inconsistent and often conflicting narrative. One witness, a nearby shop owner, recalled hearing angry voices emanating from the convenience store shortly before the attack. Another passerby mentioned seeing Marcus enter the store alone, but could not confirm what transpired inside. A third described hearing a loud crash followed by a scream, but had left the scene before the police arrived. These fragmented testimonies complicated the investigation, leaving Detective Chen to sift through layers of hearsay and uncertainty. The disparities in witness statements hinted at a more volatile relationship between Marcus and Jennings than initially apparent. Some witnesses suggested that Marcus had been involved in heated disputes with Jennings over the past weeks, while others insisted the teenager was merely a bystander caught in a tragic moment. The forensic team's analysis added further complexity to the case. Blood spatter patterns indicated a close-range attack, with several droplets found on the walls and shelves near the victim. The distribution and angle of the blood suggested that the stabbing was not a single impulsive act, but rather a series of strikes delivered in rapid succession. This evidence contradicted Marcus's claim that he had only intended to scare Jennings and had acted solely in self-defense. Detective Chen noted that the victim's defensive wounds, cuts and bruises on his hands and forearms, implied an attempt to fend off the assailant, pointing to a violent struggle rather than a one-sided attack. The overturned shelves and broken glass corroborated this, indicating a physical confrontation that escalated quickly and ended fatally. Despite the growing evidence against Marcus, some community members remained reluctant to believe he could have committed such a crime. Friends and acquaintances described him as a youth with a troubled past, but not prone to violence. His mother, who was interviewed at the police station, painted a picture of a boy trying to navigate difficult circumstances, expressing hope that the truth would emerge and that Marcus would be given a fair chance. As the investigation continued, Detective Chen focused on reconciling the inconsistencies between Marcus's account and the physical evidence. She questioned why the knife had been wiped clean of fingerprints if the stabbing was a sudden act of self-defense. Why had Marcus remained at the scene, seemingly composed instead of seeking help or fleeing? The detective understood that these anomalies were critical to uncovering the full story. Surveillance footage became a key element in the unfolding case. Cameras from nearby businesses were reviewed, revealing Marcus entering the convenience store alone in the early evening. The footage showed him browsing the aisles briefly before making his way to the counter. Minutes later, Marcus was seen leaving in haste, his movements hurried and tense. The timeline suggested a brief but intense encounter inside the store, contradicting Marcus's assertion that he had been threatened upon entry and acted only in reaction. Further analysis of the footage uncovered subtle details, a glimpse of a heated exchange between Marcus and Jennings, visible through the store's glass window, moments before the violent episode. This evidence supported witness accounts of prior disputes and suggested a pre-existing tension that may have contributed to the fatal confrontation. Detective Chen also coordinated with forensic specialists to examine the clothing Marcus wore that evening. Tests revealed traces of the victim's blood on Marcus's jacket and shirt sleeves, confirming his close physical involvement in the altercation. DNA evidence further placed Marcus at the center of the struggle, making it increasingly difficult to uphold his narrative of accidental self-defense. The mounting evidence and conflicting testimonies deepened the mystery. Detective Chen recognized the challenge in untangling truth from fabrication, especially when the suspect was a teenager navigating the pressures of his environment. She understood that the case would require a thorough and nuanced approach to ensure justice was served. As the investigation progressed, the community's reaction intensified. Public concern grew over the safety of the neighborhood and the potential for escalating youth violence. Local leaders called for calm and urged residents to allow law enforcement to conduct a comprehensive inquiry. Meanwhile, Marcus's family faced mounting pressure and scrutiny, caught between defense and despair. Detective Chen prepared for the next phase of the investigation, aware that piecing together the events of that night would be crucial. Interviews with Marcus would need to be revisited, forensic evidence re-examined, and new leads pursued. Each detail held the potential to reshape the narrative and bring clarity to a case marked by confusion and tragedy. The violent stabbing of Harold Jennings had opened a complex and painful chapter for Cleveland, one that would test the limits of law enforcement, the resilience of a community, and the uncertain path of a troubled youth. As the investigation unfolded, Detective Chen remained committed to uncovering the truth, driven by the hope that justice could be achieved amid the chaos. Marcus Reynolds' background began to unfold as Detective Laura Chen delved deeper into the teenager's life, uncovering a troubled past marked by small offenses and strained family dynamics. At 17, Marcus had a record dotted with petty thefts and minor run-ins with law enforcement, though none had involved violence. His reputation among peers was complicated, seen as a kid who often found himself on the wrong side of the law, but rarely someone who would escalate to serious crime. Those who knew him described a young man grappling with hardship rather than innate aggression. Raised by a single mother in one of Cleveland's tougher neighborhoods, Marcus's upbringing was shadowed by economic struggle and limited opportunities. His mother, Denise Reynolds, worked multiple jobs to keep the household afloat, often leaving Marcus to fend for himself during long stretches of the day. The neighborhood was rife with challenges: poverty, crime, and a pervasive sense of instability. Denise's efforts to steer her son away from trouble were ongoing but fraught with difficulty, as Marcus often sought refuge among friends who shared similar struggles. Friends and relatives portrayed Marcus as a youth with potential but burdened by his environment. They spoke of moments when he expressed a desire to turn his life around, to escape the cycle that seemed to entrap so many in their community. Yet, these aspirations were tempered by the realities he faced daily: pressure from peers, lack of stable adult guidance, and the temptation of quick money that petty crime offered. Marcus's history of minor offenses was less about malice and more about survival in a world that often seemed stacked against him. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been dealing with mounting stress in the weeks leading up to the stabbing. Financial strain was evident in overdue bills and rent notices, while social tensions simmered beneath the surface. Detective Chen's inquiries into Marcus's recent interactions showed signs of escalating conflicts, particularly with Harold Jennings, the victim. Some neighbors recounted heated exchanges between the two, centered around unpaid debts and accusations of theft, suggesting a fraught relationship that might have contributed to the fatal confrontation. Denise Reynolds, when interviewed, painted a picture of a son caught in a difficult phase of adolescence. She described Marcus as sometimes moody and rebellious, but fundamentally good-hearted. She acknowledged their struggles, but maintained hope that Marcus could find a better path. "He's made mistakes, sure, but he's not a bad kid," she said tearfully. "I just want him to have a chance to prove himself." Marcus himself offered his version of events during initial questioning, emphasizing the tension between him and Jennings. He described feeling threatened by the store owner, who he claimed had become increasingly hostile toward him. According to Marcus, the night of the stabbing was the culmination of a series of confrontations, with Jennings allegedly accusing him of theft and demanding repayment for money Marcus insisted he did not owe. Marcus said he went to the store intending only to clear the air, but found himself cornered and scared. His account painted a picture of escalating fear and desperation. Marcus recounted how words quickly turned into threats and how he believed he was in danger. He maintained that he had no intention to kill Jennings, that the stabbing was a reaction to being backed into a corner. However, his portrayal of events was complicated by the forensic evidence and witness statements collected by Detective Chen's team, which hinted at a more volatile and possibly premeditated encounter. The strained relationship between Marcus and his mother added another layer to the story. Denise revealed that their home life was often tense, with frequent arguments over Marcus's behavior and choices. She spoke of her fears that he was drifting toward a path that could lead to serious trouble. Yet, despite these challenges, she remained a steadfast supporter, advocating for his potential and pleading for understanding from the authorities. Detective Chen's interviews with Marcus's friends and acquaintances offered further insight into his social environment. Many described a young man caught between childhood and adulthood, struggling to define himself amid conflicting influences. Some friends expressed concern about Marcus's association with individuals involved in criminal activity, while others noted his efforts to stay out of trouble. This dichotomy underscored the complexity of Marcus's situation and the challenges he faced in navigating his world. As the investigation progressed, Detective Chen began to see Marcus not just as a suspect, but as a product of his circumstances. His background illuminated the pressures and vulnerabilities that may have shaped his actions that night. Yet, these contextual factors did not excuse the violence that claimed Harold Jennings' life, nor did they diminish the need for accountability. The case also highlighted broader issues within the community: poverty, lack of support for at-risk youth, and the tensions that can erupt when lives are marked by hardship. It raised questions about how young people like Marcus might be helped before situations escalate into tragedy. For Detective Chen, these reflections added urgency to her work, reinforcing the importance of thorough investigation balanced with sensitivity to the human elements involved. In the days following the initial discovery, Marcus's story began to resonate beyond the confines of the police station and the courtroom. Community leaders and social workers called for increased attention to youth services, emphasizing prevention and intervention. Neighborhood meetings discussed ways to address the root causes of violence, seeking solutions to break cycles of poverty and crime. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in custody, grappling with the weight of the accusations and the reality of the situation. His youth and background became central to discussions about his future. Whether he would be treated as a juvenile in the legal system or face adult charges. These decisions carried profound implications, not only for Marcus, but for the community's approach to justice and rehabilitation. Detective Chen prepared for the next phase of the investigation, aware that understanding Marcus's past was crucial, but that the focus must remain on uncovering the facts of the night in question. Each interview, piece of evidence, and testimony would contribute to a complex puzzle, one that intertwined personal history with the stark realities of crime and consequence. As Marcus's story unfolded, it became clear that this was more than a criminal case. It was a reflection of broader societal challenges and the fragile line between youthful mistakes and tragic outcomes. Detective Chen steeled herself for the difficult work ahead, committed to seeking truth amid the complexities of human behavior and circumstance. Detective Laura Chen's confidence in Marcus Reynolds' self-defense claim began to waver as inconsistencies emerged during the course of her interviews and evidence review. Initially, Marcus had presented his story with a composed demeanor, insisting that he had acted solely to protect himself from an aggressive threat posed by Harold Jennings. But as Chen and her team dug deeper, discrepancies in Marcus's timeline and details began to surface, casting doubt on the veracity of his account. One of the first breakthroughs came with the retrieval of surveillance footage from neighboring businesses. Reviewing hours of video, investigators observed Marcus entering the convenience store alone shortly before the time of the stabbing. The footage showed him entering at approximately 7:45 p.m., browsing the aisles briefly, and then approaching the counter where Jennings stood. What followed was a brief but visibly tense interaction captured through the store window, with both men gesturing heatedly. Moments later, Marcus was seen leaving the store hurriedly, his posture tense and his movements rushed. This visual evidence contradicted Marcus's initial timeline, which had suggested a prolonged period of being cornered and threatened inside the store. Instead, the footage suggested a relatively brief encounter that escalated rapidly. Detective Chen noted that the discrepancy undermined Marcus's claim of a spontaneous act of defense during an extended confrontation. Further forensic analysis deepened the suspicion surrounding Marcus's narrative. His fingerprints were found on the handle of the kitchen knife used in the stabbing, contradicting the earlier assumption that the blade had been wiped clean. Although the blade itself had fewer identifiable prints, the presence of Marcus's prints on the handle indicated direct contact and control of the weapon during the incident. More telling was the pattern of blood spatter found on Marcus's clothing. Specialists observed that the distribution of blood droplets suggested an aggressive attack rather than a defensive reaction. The spatter was consistent with Marcus being in close proximity to the victim during multiple stabbing motions, rather than a single defensive strike. This forensic detail challenged the notion that Marcus had acted out of fear alone. Witnesses who had initially been reluctant to come forward began to provide statements that further complicated the picture. Several reported hearing Marcus threaten Jennings in the days leading up to the stabbing, describing verbal altercations that hinted at escalating hostility. One neighbor recounted overhearing Marcus say, "You're going to pay for what you did," during an argument outside the store. Such comments suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of self-defense. Detective Chen also scrutinized the physical evidence inside the store. The overturned shelves and broken glass were not random. Their placement indicated a struggle that extended beyond a simple defensive scuffle. The positioning of the victim's body and the knife's location suggested that Marcus had the opportunity to retreat, but instead engaged in a sustained assault. Confronted with these contradictions, Marcus's account began to unravel. When Chen pressed him for clarification, Marcus's answers became evasive and inconsistent. At times, he admitted to feeling angry and frustrated with Jennings, but he maintained that he never intended to cause serious harm. His narrative shifted between regret and justification, revealing the psychological turmoil beneath his composed exterior. Detective Chen's growing skepticism was echoed by the prosecution team, who saw in the evidence a case for premeditated violence rather than accidental defense. The severity of the crime and the forensic findings suggested that Marcus had escalated the conflict beyond what his initial story portrayed. The community's reaction to these developments was mixed. Some residents struggled to reconcile the image of Marcus as a troubled but nonviolent youth with the possibility of calculated aggression. Others expressed concern over the potential consequences for a teenager facing serious charges. The tension underscored the complexities of dealing with juvenile offenders accused of violent crimes. Meanwhile, Marcus's defense attorneys began preparing for the challenges ahead. They focused on his age and background, emphasizing his troubled upbringing and the pressures that may have influenced his actions. They sought to frame the case as one involving a young person caught in a difficult situation, rather than a cold-blooded assailant. Despite these efforts, the mounting evidence weighed heavily against Marcus. Detective Chen continued to gather and analyze data, determined to build a comprehensive understanding of the events. Her interviews extended to neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, each conversation adding pieces to the puzzle. One particularly significant witness was a local resident who had heard the altercation unfold through an open window. Their testimony described raised voices escalating to screams, followed by the sound of a scuffle and a sudden silence. This account aligned with the forensic evidence of a violent and rapid confrontation. As the investigation progressed, Detective Chen reflected on the challenges of discerning truth in cases involving young suspects. The interplay of fear, anger, and confusion often blurred the lines between intention and accident. Yet, the evidence before her painted a clear picture of a violent encounter that went beyond self-preservation. The case took on added urgency as prosecutors prepared to file charges. The question of whether Marcus would be tried as a juvenile or an adult loomed, with significant implications for sentencing and rehabilitation. Community advocates weighed in, calling for nuanced approaches that balanced accountability with the potential for reform. Throughout this period, Marcus remained in custody, facing the reality of the serious allegations. His demeanor shifted from initial calm to a mix of anxiety and defiance during later interviews. The pressure of the evidence and the weight of the impending legal battle took their toll. Detective Chen's meticulous work set the stage for the next phase of the case. Legal proceedings that would examine the evidence in detail and challenge the competing narratives. Her investigation had moved beyond initial impressions to a complex, evidence-driven inquiry that would test the limits of truth and justice. In the quiet moments between interviews and evidence reviews, Chen contemplated the broader implications of the case. It was a stark reminder of the fragile line between youthful mistakes and tragic outcomes, and the importance of thorough, unbiased investigation in the pursuit of justice. As the city awaited the unfolding of legal decisions, the story of Marcus Reynolds and Harold Jennings remained a somber reflection of conflict, consequence, and the difficult path toward resolution. Detective Chen prepared to present her findings, aware that the coming weeks would demand both rigor and sensitivity in equal measure. As Detective Laura Chen's investigation deepened, new revelations emerged that began to shed light on the possible motives behind the fatal stabbing of Harold Jennings. Police obtained access to Marcus Reynolds' phone, discovering a trove of text messages that revealed a tense and contentious relationship between Marcus and the victim. These messages became critical in understanding the dynamics that may have led to the violent confrontation. Among the recovered communications were exchanges in which Jennings accused Marcus of owing money for unpaid rent on a small storage unit the store owner had lent to him. Marcus's replies were defensive, denying any outstanding debt and expressing frustration over Jennings's repeated demands. The tone of the messages escalated over the weeks, with Marcus at times threatening to sever ties and Jennings responding with increasingly hostile language. Financial records corroborated the conflict suggested by the texts. Marcus was behind on rent for his apartment by several months, struggling to make ends meet. His bank statements showed a pattern of irregular deposits and withdrawals, indicating financial instability. This added weight to the theory that monetary disputes might have been a significant factor in the altercation. The discovery of these tensions marked a shift in the investigation. What had initially been framed by Marcus as a self-defense incident now appeared to have elements of premeditated conflict. Detective Chen and her team began to consider that the stabbing might have been motivated, at least in part, by financial desperation and resentment. Further forensic analysis provided additional support for this theory. The bloodstains found on Marcus's clothing were consistent with close and repeated contact with the victim during a violent struggle, suggesting an intense and possibly prolonged attack. DNA testing confirmed the presence of Harold Jennings's blood on Marcus's jacket and shirt, firmly placing him at the center of the fatal encounter. Clothing recovered from Marcus was carefully examined, revealing not only blood spatter, but also traces of broken glass and dirt, indicating a physical struggle that extended beyond the initial stabbing. This evidence countered Marcus's earlier claims that the attack was a momentary act of defense, and instead pointed toward a more aggressive confrontation. Detective Chen's review of the crime scene further underscored the violent nature of the encounter. The overturned shelves and shattered glass were not incidental but signified a chaotic fight. The positioning of the victim's body near the cash register and the discarded knife nearby painted a picture of a struggle that escalated rapidly and ended tragically. Interviews with neighbors and witnesses added layers to the emerging narrative. Several individuals reported hearing Marcus threaten Jennings days before the incident, referencing money owed and expressing anger over perceived grievances. One witness recounted hearing Marcus say, "If you keep pushing me, there'll be consequences," a statement that suggested premeditation. Marcus's family members, while acknowledging the financial difficulties he faced, expressed shock at the notion that these disputes could have led to such violence. Denise Reynolds, Marcus's mother, reiterated her belief that her son was not capable of intentional harm, though she admitted the mounting evidence was hard to reconcile. As the investigation progressed, the legal team preparing the prosecution's case highlighted these findings as central to establishing motive. The financial disputes and threatening communications painted a picture of escalating tensions that culminated in a deadly outcome. Prosecutors argued that the evidence indicated more than a spontaneous act of self-defense, suggesting a calculated response driven by desperation. Meanwhile, defense attorneys sought to contextualize Marcus's behavior, emphasizing his youth and the pressures of his environment. They argued that financial stress and emotional turmoil could have impaired his judgment, leading to an impulsive act rather than premeditation. This perspective aimed to mitigate the severity of the charges and advocate for a more rehabilitative approach. Detective Chen remained focused on ensuring that all evidence was thoroughly examined and accurately presented. She coordinated with forensic experts to prepare detailed reports and worked closely with prosecutors to build a comprehensive case. Every piece of evidence, from text messages to financial documents, was scrutinized to construct a timeline that reflected the complexity of the events. The community watched closely as the investigation unfolded, grappling with the implications of the findings. The revelation of financial disputes as a possible motive sparked conversations about the socioeconomic challenges faced by many residents. Local organizations called for increased support for families struggling with poverty and instability, emphasizing prevention as a key to reducing violence. In the days leading up to the formal charges, law enforcement held press briefings to update the public on the progress of the case. Detective Chen addressed questions about the motive, acknowledging the complexity and emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing. She stressed the importance of allowing the legal process to proceed without prejudice. Marcus's case became emblematic of broader societal issues, the intersection of poverty, youth, and violence. The narrative that surfaced through the evidence highlighted how financial desperation and strained relationships could spiral into tragedy. For Detective Chen, the case underscored the need for a multifaceted approach to crime prevention that considered not just the act itself, but the circumstances that precipitated it. As the legal proceedings approached, the focus shifted toward the courtroom, where the evidence collected would be tested against defense strategies. The role of digital communication, forensic science, and financial records in establishing motive would be pivotal. Detective Chen prepared to provide testimony, ready to detail the investigative findings with clarity and precision. Marcus Reynolds remained in custody, facing serious charges that carried the possibility of life-altering consequences. His future hinged on the court's interpretation of the evidence and the competing narratives presented by prosecution and defense. The tension within the community persisted, reflecting the challenges inherent in balancing justice with compassion. Through it all, Detective Chen maintained her commitment to uncovering the truth. The case of Harold Jennings' stabbing was no longer just about a single violent act, but a window into the complex interplay of human behavior, environment, and consequence. As the investigation moved toward trial, the hope remained that justice would be served, informed by a comprehensive understanding of all factors involved. Marcus Reynolds was arrested shortly after the completion of the initial investigation, his detention marking a pivotal moment in a case that had already captured the attention of Cleveland's community. Taken into custody at the juvenile detention center, Marcus faced charges that would soon ignite intense debate around the appropriate handling of violent offenders under the age of 18. His lawyers immediately began advocating for leniency, emphasizing Marcus's youth, troubled background, and potential for rehabilitation. They argued that despite the severity of the crime, Marcus was still a teenager capable of growth and change, and that the justice system should prioritize his future over punishment. Defense counsel highlighted his difficult upbringing, financial struggles, and the emotional pressures he faced, painting a portrait of a young man who had made a tragic mistake rather than a cold-blooded decision. Prosecutors, however, pushed back with equal vigor. Citing the brutal nature of the stabbing and the evidence suggesting premeditation, they argued that Marcus's case warranted adult charges. The prosecution underscored the severity of the crime, asserting that the community's safety depended on ensuring accountability regardless of age. They maintained that the evidence indicated a calculated and violent act, not a momentary lapse, and that Marcus's youth should not exempt him from facing the full weight of the law. This clash of perspectives soon became a focal point of local discourse, sparking heated debates among legal experts, community leaders, and residents. Many questioned where the line should be drawn between juvenile justice and adult prosecution, especially in cases involving violent offenses. Advocates for youth offenders argued that the developmental science of adolescent brain maturity supported a rehabilitative approach, while others stressed the need for justice and deterrence. The controversy extended beyond legal circles, permeating schools, churches, and community centers. Public forums were held to discuss juvenile justice reform, with voices from all sides expressing concern about the implications of trying minors as adults. Some community members feared that harsh sentencing would further marginalize vulnerable youth, while others worried that leniency could embolden violent behavior. Meanwhile, Marcus's legal team mounted a vigorous defense strategy. They sought to underscore the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, highlighting Marcus's age and emotional state at the time of the incident. Defense attorneys presented evidence of his troubled background, including his family's financial hardships and his limited support network. Expert witnesses were prepared to testify about adolescent brain development, emphasizing the potential for change and rehabilitation. In contrast, the prosecution assembled a compelling body of evidence to justify adult charges. Forensic reports, witness testimonies, and digital communications painted a picture of a deliberate and escalating conflict, culminating in a deadly outcome. Prosecutors aimed to demonstrate that Marcus's actions went beyond impulsivity, suggesting a level of intent consistent with first-degree murder. As the legal wrangling intensified, Marcus remained in juvenile detention, confronting the reality of his situation. The prospect of being tried as an adult loomed large, bringing with it the possibility of a life sentence without parole. The pressure weighed heavily on him, as did the strain on his family, who faced public scrutiny and emotional turmoil. The case's progression highlighted systemic challenges within the criminal justice system regarding youth offenders. It exposed the tension between punitive measures and rehabilitative goals, raising questions about fairness, effectiveness, and societal responsibility. Legal scholars debated the precedents and policies governing juvenile prosecutions, while policymakers considered potential reforms in response to public concern. In the courtroom, pre-trial hearings became arenas for these broader issues to unfold. Judges grappled with the decision of whether Marcus should be transferred to adult court, weighing the evidence, the nature of the crime, and Marcus's personal circumstances. The hearings drew media attention, amplifying the community's engagement with the case and its implications. Detective Laura Chen, though primarily focused on the investigation, observed the legal developments with keen interest. She recognized the complexities involved in balancing justice and compassion, particularly when youth and violence intersected. Her role remained centered on ensuring that the facts were presented clearly and accurately, contributing to a fair process. Community organizations responded by launching initiatives aimed at preventing youth violence and supporting at-risk teens. Programs focused on mentorship, education, and mental health sought to address the root causes that might lead young individuals down dangerous paths. These efforts reflected a collective desire to learn from the tragedy and foster safer, more supportive environments. As the legal process moved forward, the question of Marcus's fate remained unresolved. The debate over juvenile versus adult prosecution underscored the broader societal struggle to reconcile accountability with hope for redemption. For Marcus, the outcome would determine not only his future, but also signal the community's stance on justice and rehabilitation for its youngest members. The case of Marcus Reynolds thus transcended its immediate circumstances, becoming a touchstone for discussions about juvenile justice reform, the treatment of young offenders, and the challenges of addressing violence among youth. In the days ahead, as trial preparations continued, the community braced for the difficult questions and decisions that lay ahead, seeking a path that balanced the demands of justice with the prospects of healing and change. The trial of Marcus Reynolds commenced amid widespread attention, drawing community members, legal experts, and media observers eager to witness the unfolding of a case that had stirred deep emotions across Cleveland. The courtroom was tense as prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared to present their starkly contrasting narratives to the jury, each side armed with compelling evidence and poignant testimony. The prosecution opened with a detailed recitation of the forensic findings, highlighting the blood spatter patterns on Marcus's clothing and the victim's defensive wounds. Expert witnesses testified that the multiple stab wounds inflicted on Harold Jennings were consistent with an aggressive, sustained attack, rather than a single defensive strike. The prosecution emphasized that Marcus's fingerprints on the knife handle and the surveillance footage contradicted his initial claim of self-defense, painting a picture of calculated violence. Witnesses took the stand to recount the escalating tensions between Marcus and Jennings, including neighbors who testified to overhearing threats and heated arguments in the days leading up to the stabbing. Digital evidence, including text messages retrieved from Marcus's phone, was introduced to demonstrate a pattern of hostility centered on financial disputes. Prosecutors argued that these elements established both motive and premeditation, asserting that Marcus had planned and executed the attack rather than reacting impulsively. In response, the defense sought to contextualize Marcus's actions within the framework of adolescent development and emotional turmoil. Expert testimony from psychologists underscored the complexities of the teenage brain, emphasizing areas related to impulse control, risk assessment, and emotional regulation still maturing in individuals Marcus's age. They argued that these developmental factors diminished his capacity for premeditation and intent, casting his actions as impulsive responses to a stressful and threatening situation. Marcus himself took the stand, his testimony marked by a mixture of remorse and attempts to justify his actions as survival. He described feeling cornered by Jennings, overwhelmed by fear and frustration, and unable to envision an escape from the escalating conflict. His narrative conveyed a young man grappling with intense emotions and external pressures, struggling to make sense of the tragic outcome. Throughout the trial, the defense highlighted the inconsistencies in witness testimonies and questioned the interpretation of forensic evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for the blood spatter and timeline. They argued for leniency, appealing to the jury's sense of compassion and the potential for rehabilitation given Marcus's age and background. Jury deliberations were intense and prolonged, reflecting the weight of the decision before them. The tension in the courtroom mirrored the broader community's conflicted feelings. between the desire for justice for Harold Jennings and the recognition of Marcus Reynolds as a young person still capable of change. Ultimately, the jury rendered a verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder, rejecting the defense's plea for juvenile sentencing. The decision underscored the jury's acceptance of the prosecution's argument that Marcus's actions were deliberate and premeditated, warranting the most serious legal consequences. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community. Some residents expressed relief that justice had been served, while others mourned the harsh outcome for a teenager. The decision reignited debates over juvenile justice policies, the appropriateness of life sentences for minors, and the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Marcus's family faced the emotional aftermath of the trial with a mixture of despair and resilience. Denise Reynolds, Marcus's mother, spoke publicly about the difficulty of accepting the verdict while maintaining hope for her son's future. Supporters rallied around the family, advocating for reforms aimed at providing greater support for young offenders. The case became a focal point for discussions on adolescent brain development, legal accountability, and the complexities inherent in cases involving juvenile offenders. Legal scholars analyzed the trial's proceedings and verdict, debating the implications for future cases and juvenile justice reform efforts. In the weeks following the verdict, Marcus began the process of sentencing, confronting the realities of a life sentence without parole. The emotional toll was profound as he grappled with the consequences of his actions and the loss of freedom at such a young age. Rehabilitation programs within the correctional system offered some support, but the path ahead was daunting. Community organizations and advocacy groups seized upon the case to promote awareness and dialogue about preventing youth violence and addressing the factors that contribute to such tragedies. Initiatives focused on education, mental health resources, and family support sought to mitigate risks and provide pathways away from crime. Detective Laura Chen reflected on the trial's outcome with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal contemplation. The investigation had been thorough and meticulous, uncovering a complex story that went beyond a simple act of violence. Yet, she recognized the limitations of the criminal justice system in addressing the broader societal issues that underpin the tragedy. As Marcus served his sentence, the case continued to influence conversations about juvenile justice reform, highlighting the need for policies that balance accountability with opportunities for growth and redemption. The legacy of the trial extended beyond the courtroom, shaping perspectives on how society confronts youth crime and its consequences. The story of Marcus Reynolds remained a somber reminder of the fragile line between youthful mistakes and tragic outcomes, a narrative that challenged communities to seek justice while fostering compassion and understanding for the complexities of adolescent development and human behavior. Marcus Reynolds was sentenced to life in adult prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The severity of the sentence shocked many who had anticipated a juvenile disposition, igniting national conversations about the treatment of minors in the criminal justice system and the appropriate consequences for violent youth offenders. The sentencing marked a pivotal moment in the ongoing debate over juvenile justice reform, with advocates on both sides raising compelling arguments. Supporters of the harsh sentence emphasized the brutal nature of the crime and the need for accountability, arguing that violent offenses demanded serious repercussions regardless of age. They contended that protecting the community and delivering justice to the victim's family were paramount concerns. Conversely, opponents decried the life sentence as excessively punitive for a teenager, highlighting scientific research on adolescent brain development that suggests young offenders possess a greater capacity for change and rehabilitation. They argued that sentencing minors to life without parole ignored these developmental realities and risked consigning youth to a lifetime of lost potential. The case of Marcus Reynolds became a flashpoint for discussions on the ethics and efficacy of such sentences. In the wake of sentencing, community organizations and legal advocacy groups mobilized to address the broader implications of Marcus's case. Efforts intensified to promote legislative reforms aimed at preventing life sentences without parole for juveniles, emphasizing alternatives that focus on rehabilitation and reintegration. These initiatives sought to balance the demands of justice with compassion and the recognition of youth's unique capacity for growth. Marcus's family grappled with the profound emotional toll of the verdict and sentence. Denise Reynolds spoke publicly about the pain of losing her son to the prison system and the challenges of reconciling the tragedy with her hopes for his future. The family's ordeal underscored the human cost of harsh sentencing policies and the ripple effects felt by loved ones. Within the prison system, Marcus faced the daunting reality of serving a life sentence at a young age. His incarceration became a case study in juvenile justice, with discussions about the support and programming available to youth sentenced to adult facilities. Advocates called for specialized rehabilitation services tailored to the needs of young inmates, aiming to foster personal growth despite restrictive circumstances. The case also sparked renewed dialogue within the legal community, prompting courts and lawmakers to re-examine policies related to juvenile sentencing. Some jurisdictions began to reconsider mandatory life sentences without parole for minors, exploring alternatives that incorporate developmental science and provide avenues for eventual release based on demonstrated rehabilitation. As Marcus served his sentence, he engaged in personal reflection and growth, confronting the consequences of his actions. His journey highlighted the complexities of juvenile crime and punishment, illustrating the tensions between justice, accountability, and the hope for redemption. His story became a reference point for educators, legal professionals, and policymakers seeking to balance these competing interests. The legacy of the Marcus Reynolds case extended beyond one individual, influencing broader societal views on juvenile offenders and the criminal justice system. It prompted ongoing examination of how to address serious crimes committed by youth while fostering environments that support rehabilitation and prevent future violence. In classrooms, courtrooms, and community forums, the case was cited in discussions about the intersection of adolescence, crime, and justice. It served as a catalyst for reforms and inspired efforts to create more nuanced approaches to juvenile sentencing, emphasizing evidence-based practices and individualized assessments. The tragic events that led to Harold Jennings' death and Marcus Reynolds' conviction continued to resonate within the Cleveland community and beyond. The case became emblematic of the challenges faced when youth engage in violent crime and the difficulties inherent in crafting just and effective responses. As time passed, Marcus's story remained a poignant reminder of the fragile line between youthful error and irrevocable consequence. It underscored the need for a justice system that recognizes the unique circumstances of juvenile offenders while upholding the principles of accountability and public safety. Through ongoing reflection and reform, the community sought to learn from this tragedy, striving to prevent similar outcomes and support young people in navigating the pressures that can lead to violence. The case of Marcus Reynolds thus became a catalyst for change, shaping legal perspectives and societal attitudes toward juvenile justice for years to come.